on these nice green benches. I suppose they're benches, not quite the House of Commons, but they look roughly similar. Welcome to the Conduit Club and this On Frontline event. My name's Chris Morris. I work with Pranvera with these On Frontline events. My day job is running something called Full Fact. So at the moment we're trying to keep politicians honest for what they say. So June is proving to be a slightly busier month than we anticipated a few weeks ago. But we're doing our best. Before that, for a long time, I was a foreign correspondent with the BBC. And I guess my first love is international affairs. So that's why I enjoy hosting these panels. And the panel today, I guess we're going to talk about the geopolitics of drugs, because we often sort of focus in these sessions on individual countries or individual issues, but this is one of those issues that kind of cuts across so many things. And we've got a fantastic panel with us this evening to talk about it. I'll introduce them in a moment. The format of the evening will be pretty standard. I'll introduce each of the panelists, they'll speak for a few minutes. We'll then have a chat between us here on stage, and then obviously we will have time for questions from the audience. Is this microphone working okay? Because it was very loud for a bit. You're happy with that at the back? I see thumbs up, that's excellent. So let me introduce the panel. So furthest away from me is Patrick Winn. Patrick is Asia correspondent for The World, which is a radio programme which an awful lot of people in the United States listen to and can be listened to elsewhere in the world. I know that, on NPR stations. This is his new book, latest book, Narcotopia, in search of the Asian drug cartel that outwitted the CIA. And Patrick will talk to you a little bit about that and other things in a minute. In the middle is Emma Beals. Emma is a senior advisor at the European Institute of Peace and a non-resident fellow at the Middle East Institute. And since 2012 has spent a lot of time in or covering Syria. And obviously there are interesting connections with the international drugs trade in Syria. And then closest to me, Max Daly is global drugs editor for Vice News. He's also written a book starting with the word narco, but not Narcotopia, Narcomania. And Max, obviously, as the title of his job suggests, covers issues dealing with drugs all around the world. So we've got a brilliant panel. They know a lot more about all these issues than I do, so I'm just going to be asking very simple questions. I invite you to ask the more complicated ones once we've heard from them all. And I'm going to start with you, Patrick. Narcotopia is basically about Wa State, which is one of those weird places in the world, and there are a few of them where you have essentially an undeclared state. Nobody recognizes its borders. It doesn't have a flag at the United Nations, but it genuinely exists, and there are all the functioning structures of a state there, and much of that state is built on, in one way or another, on the drugs trade. Patrick.
Yeah. Thanks for coming, everyone. Yeah, I'm an American journalist. I've been based in Bangkok for the last 16 years and cover the East Asian drug trade. And the big player in the East Asian drug trade is the United Wa State Army, or Wa State for short. Most people don't know this. Most people have never heard of Wa State, right? But it is the most powerful drug trafficking organization on planet Earth. It is resident inside the borders of Burma, or Myanmar, and it controls as much soil as the Netherlands, and it has as many troops as does Sweden, 30,000 troops. If it sounds like I'm hitting you over the head with superlatives and big numbers, it's because I'm really trying to drive home how big of a deal this drug trafficking organization is, and just how little is known about it. Wa State is not like the cartels in Mexico. It's not like the drug syndicates in Europe, because it is not a purely for-profit enterprise. Wa State is exactly what it sounds like. It's a state. It's a de facto nation state, a country within a country in Myanmar. It has an agenda, and that agenda is to protect the homeland of an indigenous group, a group of people known as the Wa. Most people outside of Southeast Asia don't know about the Wa, but in Asia they're one of the most vilified groups around. In part because for centuries, up until about the 1960s, they practiced headhunting. So you would have Wa warriors as sort of a shock tactic, cutting off their enemies' heads and putting them on sticks. don't let that make you think that they are simplistic people, because they have outmaneuvered the British Empire, which tried to colonize them and failed, the DEA and the CIA. As a state, it is a very sophisticated state. It has its own government with ministries of health and finance. It has its own road network, electricity grid, school system, flag, national anthem, issues its own license plates even. So it's a very sophisticated operation. What upholds WA State's power? One, narcotics, which we'll talk more about, and two, the government of China. Chinese leaders, or Chinese operatives with the Chinese state are very intimate with WA leaders, and maybe that'll come up later, we can talk more about that. The narcotic that is flowing out of WA State is methamphetamine. So in Asia, meth is king. Like heroin's a distant second. It's all about meth. It's sold in two forms. Crystal meth, it's like the stuff you would see on Breaking Bad. And then this little pink pill that has about 20% meth in it and the rest is caffeine. It's sold for fairly cheap. It's called yaba, and it's scented. It actually has this scent that is very reminiscent of like the vanilla cream filling in an Oreo. I've been in rooms where bags of this have been cut open and it smells like a candy shop in there. Billions of these pills are sold. Billions. More than Big Macs are sold around the world. It's hugely popular and, again, pretty little known in other parts of the world. So that's my quick primer on WA State. I'll be referring back to it, I think, as questions come up. Look, for my money, this is more interesting than the story of Pablo Escobar or El Chapo. It's got, you know, American spies and DEA activity and meth and China's Communist Party, the whole thing. So yeah, we'll talk more about it as we go on.
Great, thank you, Patrick. And yeah, we will come back to WA State, but what we're going to do is essentially go to each panelist with a slightly different example of the kind of the geopolitics of drugs, and then come back to discuss it all in more detail. So Emma, maybe I could come to you. You spent a lot of time covering Syria in one form or another, and there's a drug there called Captagon, which gives President Assad an awful lot of money.
It sure does. So Captagon is kind of intrinsically tied into the conflict in Syria. The sort of expansion of the Captagon trade has tracked along with the length of the war. It's also a pill that's a mild amphetamine, popular in the Middle East, less popular further afield. You can get hold of it here and in Europe if you want to. It's not really picked up in the same way, so it's used for people who want to stay awake a bit longer. It was quite popular when there was a lot of active conflict to keep fighters awake for longer on the front lines, but it has become more popular since then. So the scale of the trade, I mean, there's been some sort of conjecture about how big the trade is, because there was one report that put a decimal point in the wrong place and confused everybody. But just last week through to Monday, 16.5 million pills were seized across the Middle East. So that's a $230 million street value, and another 9 million pills in Jordan just yesterday. So that's just the amount that's getting caught coming out of Syria into neighboring countries within about a 10-day period. So GDP in Syria is about $9 billion, but the Captagon trade is estimated around sort of $6 billion a year. So compared to the GDP of the country, quite significant. Obviously not all of that is going to the country, but a decent chunk of it is. The majority of the Captagon is produced in Bashar al-Assad's controlled areas, using pharmaceutical factories by sort of cronies and people who are associated with him. Maher al-Assad, who is his cousin, is heavily involved in it. The 4th Brigade, which is a very particular part of the military, is involved in the smuggling and so on. So it's completely linked to the regime. There isn't really any, it's not sort of just allowed, it's very much sponsored by the regime. When you sort of compare that to other parts of the economy, you know, remittances, for example, are around $3 billion a year. So you are talking about a significant part of the economy. It's built up through the conflict because there has not been any sort of productive economic activity. The conflict's gone on for a very, very long time. The regime was involved in all sorts of, looting copper wire out of refugees' houses, for example, had provided sort of part of the, economy for a period of time, but these are kind of one-off things, and once you run out of that, you need other options. And so, it has started to really bother those in the region, because you have militias like Hezbollah and so forth involved in the trade, but the Jordanians and so on, Middle Eastern states not known for really enjoying a lot of insecurities. They in Jordan and Saudi and so forth is generally frowned upon. I remember being on the Jordanian border kind of maybe 8 years ago, and the Jordanian guards showing me pictures on their phones of, oh, here's the pigeon that had the phone number for the drugs guy, and here's the football full of drugs we found. They were very, very animated about this problem, and at the time it was a much, much smaller problem. So we can get into it, I guess, in a little bit, how the region is responding to what is kind of an externalizing security threat, and how they're sort of trying to engage with the regime to try to reduce that unsuccessfully. But just to give you a little overview of what is Captagon, who's making it, and how much of a problem it is.
Great, thank you very much, Emma. Max, you are the global drugs editor, so you can probably talk to us about anything, but I did want to ask you about Mexico. A new president, Claudia Sheinbaum, has just been elected. A staggering 38 candidates were assassinated during the elections in Mexico. Many, probably not all, but many associated in one way or another with violence because of the drugs trade. There's the complex regional relationship with the United States and the kind of supplier-consumer relationship there. What are your reflections on Mexico and the way drugs and politics are intertwined?
Yeah, thank you. I'm actually not now Vice's global drugs editor, because we've all, I should have told you actually, but that might have helped. I'm actually not.
Get him off the panel quick.
We all got let go. All the journalists got let go from Vice a couple of months back. So I'm now just a freelance drug guy.
So Max is available to sell you anything you want after this panel.
Yeah. So okay, look. I mean, obviously, Mexico has been, all over, Netflix. There's so much stuff that we already know about the cartels and stuff. But I just, because of the fact that Claudia Sheinbaum has just taken the new presidency, I just, we wanted to give you a quick sort of rundown of the issues facing that country. Very nice that it is. So yeah, I mean, there's been sort of about, over 170,000 people murdered and another 43,000 people gone missing during AMLO's 5.5 years in charge. So if you just think, over 170,000 people murdered due to organised crime, in this country, 500 people are murdered every year, and whatever, I don't know, like 10% of that might be connected to organised crime. It just gives you an idea of the incredible numbers involved here. And the two dominant, just again a reminder, the two dominant groups there is the Sinaloa cartel and the Jalisco New Generation cartel. And drug traffickers are also diversified, not just involved in fentanyl and weed and heroin and all this kind of stuff. They're involved in logging and protection rackets and migrant trafficking. They're also, have, as Chris mentioned, they have interfered in the elections. 36 candidates, and another 45 people linked to the election have been murdered. 15 more kidnapped as well. And again, they're a big employer in Mexico. About 175,000 employees in the Mexican cartels, which is quite a few people. It's the fifth biggest employer in the country. And also, and I suppose the question is, how much control do they actually have in Mexico? Are they a dominant force over the government? I think the best way of describing this, it was described by Winn, a really great journalist who operates out of Mexico. He described it as the cartels having a duopoly of power in parts of the country between the government and the cartels. So it's almost like they're both governing Mexico, and obviously more so in some parts of the country than others. There's also a problem with rising meth addiction in Mexico. AMLO's policy up until now has been sort of, he described it as a hugs not bullets policy of non-confrontation with the cartels, but it obviously hasn't worked because tons of people are dead. You know, record numbers of people dying. And just in terms of obviously the foreign looking situation is, of course, you have the terrible fentanyl and synthetic opioid situation, the crisis in America, North America, Canada too, with, you know, like 70,000 people dying every year from synthetic opioids, most of which have been produced by the cartels in Mexico, whether it has been to replace heroin in heroin deals, street heroin deals, or to replace, or in fake oxycodone pills, which obviously are a lot more sort of widely used than street heroin. Yeah, and there's also, the cartels have also started seeping into Europe as well. They're involved in meth production labs in Holland and Belgium, and they're always there and thereabouts in a lot of the sort of the big mafias and cartels in Europe. So, you know, it's a huge problem that this new president has got to try and deal with, and good luck to her.
Yeah, good luck indeed. I guess one of the things I'm interested in, and a question to all of you really, is the extent to which drugs either create a state in the example of WA, or sustain a state. I mean, would WA state exist without drugs if that drugs trade wasn't there? To what extent would Assad be struggling to cling on if it wasn't for the money it generates? And I mean, Mexico or other examples, Max, of how much the extent to which drugs and the money they provide and the power it produces is actually the fundamental part of the state.
Well, a bit controversial to say. I mean, I wrote all about this narco state, and I think people assume going in that the attitude is one that this should not exist and it should be destroyed because it is a narco state and that is bad. Well, it's a little more complicated than that. If those of you who know anything about Myanmar, the one thing you know is that there's a military regime that persecutes the ethnic minorities of Myanmar. So right now, Myanmar is going through a raging revolution. The most stable government in Myanmar is not the military regime. It is actually WA state, this government inside Myanmar up in the mountains. If it didn't have narcotics, no, it would wither away. I don't think they would have enough money to sustain a 30,000 troop standing army. And the WA indigenous people would be just one more minority ground down and persecuted by the military. So should the narco state exist? Should it not exist? I'm just saying that if it weren't for narcotics, that this, 500,000 people living in Myanmar who want to protect their homeland would not be able to do so. You might be thinking, oh, why don't they just, make widgets or something? Up in the mountains of Myanmar, especially where they live, the soil is really bad. I mean, even rice and corn struggle to grow. But it's actually perfect for growing the opium poppy. So you see this in Afghanistan as well. The soil is very bad. It's not a very fecund country, but poppies grow. And so this is how originally this group got involved in the drug trade. It's the only thing that they could grow and sell to sustain themselves. And then, of course, later they switched to methamphetamine. I would argue that they actually went all synthetic before the Mexican cartels did. So, it's not such a clear black and white answer as to what should be done.
I think the thing you need to know about the Assad regime is the Assad regime is out for the Assad regime. It's a violent dictatorship that runs a corrupt, kleptocratic patronage system to maintain their own power, not to actually run a country. And so the way that they run the drugs trade is very similar to the way that they run the country more broadly. For them to maintain power, they have to keep their patronage system happy, and so that's what the drugs trade does. It's still an extractive part of the economy, and that the people who are making a ton of money out of it are not putting that money back into the economy, into their local community, and doing good aid works with their neighbors. No, they're putting the money into UAE bank accounts or wherever else, and they're, you know, buying nice houses in countries that are less concerned about their sanctions, and driving nice cars. You have some aspects of the broader regime who are propped up by it, so the 4th Division, for example, who are involved in it, various warlords and so on. So in terms of, it's helping the regime itself. If you think of the regime as a very small component of the government as a concept, it is helping them to maintain power. It's not helping the country stay afloat. It is also giving that regime a bargaining chip with the region and the world writ large, which is a very large bargaining chip, right? So what's happening with their engagements with their neighbors is the neighbors are saying, we don't like these drugs that are coming across the border. That's been kind of an entry point for the negotiations between Arab states and the regime. But of course, unless you're going to replace a few $1 billion of income, you know, it's a much harder conversation. Like, yes, they're a critical player in terms of reducing that drugs trade, but they kind of have a bribery sort of tactic as a result of the drug trade as well, because they can keep sort of saying, well, why would we act in, you know, against our self-interest by cutting down something that is giving us so much income? Not that they're being explicit about that in the first place. So it's certainly not sort of a positive part of you know, the current situation across Syria, but it is maintaining the regime itself for sure, and the sort of broader oppressive system.
Yeah, so it's like, you know, the drug trade, you know, loves and flourishes, you know, in war zones, weak governments, where the rule of law is low, and obviously this is enabled, you know, in the case of these two guys, you know, it's enabled by the authorities themselves. But sometimes it's just, you know, it's a kind of a grey area, whether it's the authorities themselves or whether it's the authorities are kind of turning a blind eye. You know, there's lots of examples where, you know, in Africa, in places like Nigeria and Guinea-Bissau, obviously in Latin America, you know, in places, you know, Venezuela and Ecuador, and increasingly in the Balkans as well, you know, places like Albania, Serbia. So there's a lot of very, very high up gangsters who are very, very friendly with the government. So it becomes hard to sort of pull apart the two different elements. And I just wanted to, I don't know if you're going to ask a question about it later, so I will leave it if you are, but are we going to talk about conflict and the drug trade, or should I leave that till later?
I was going to ask about that next, so
Oh my
boots.
God. Oh my
Fill your
God.
boots. Oh my
Okay.
God.
Oh my God. So, okay, so yeah, I just wanted to talk about, you know, Afghanistan's quite an interesting, again, like I said, you know, like, you know, as soon as areas are vulnerable, and obviously conflict makes areas, regions vulnerable, it's great for the drug gangs, because they'll take advantage of that. And it's just quite interesting, just Afghanistan as an example. Russia's invasion of Afghanistan, what they did is they absolutely trashed all the sort of the farming systems and irrigation systems. So the only crop that the Afghan farmers could grow was poppy. So in a way, you know, Russia's invasion of Afghanistan sort of created the biggest opium industry in the world. You know, now Afghanistan provides, you know, like 80% of the world's heroin. There obviously has been a ban on Taliban. I'll talk about that later. By the Taliban, I'll talk about that later. But then you know, the US invasion of Afghanistan took out the Taliban, and poppy flourished. But obviously the US were saying, and the UK were saying, hey, we're going to get part of the reason why we're going into Afghanistan is get rid of the poppy, but they realised they couldn't do that because they would annoy everyone, because so many people in Afghanistan, it's a narco state, so many people rely on the poppy to feed their families. So they realised they couldn't do that, so poppy flourished during the time after the US and the UK invaded Afghanistan, and as soon as they've come out, the Taliban have come back into power and actually clamped down on poppy. So that's going to be potentially causing a lot of problems for European potential European opioid crisis. Yeah, so I just wanted to just mention, the Afghanistan example.
Yeah, I mean, Afghanistan is interesting because the Taliban have slightly gone counterintuitive on us, and as you say, that you would imagine that conflict and the drugs trade goes together. I mean, Emma, you've done a lot on conflict resolution. Does the drugs trade make it more difficult to resolve conflicts? I mean, because lots of vested interests can suddenly go from a wartime economy to a peacetime economy and still be using the same product, right?
Well, I think the main thing the Captagon situation in Syria shows us is the danger of not resolving conflicts, right? So this current trend where you can just de-escalate below minimum levels of acceptable violence and leave conflicts on slow boil until there's some sort of black swan event that changes the calculus and you come back and change it. And this is something we're seeing increasingly with the sort of shift in geopolitics and fragmentation and so on, which makes conflicts more difficult to solve, is this idea that you can just sort of let conflicts rage or negotiate them down to a certain level that stays off the front page and doesn't embarrass anybody, but leaves everybody in this perpetual sort of state of insecurity. And that's kind of, I think, where Syria has been for a long time, and that's why the drugs trade has really flourished, because in the absence of any ability to move from what is still an unresolved conflict and is still an unstable situation with no chance of sanctions being lifted or any productive economic activity or long-term sustainable peace, and it means that that's the perfect environment for this, and that's exactly what has happened. And then what we've seen in terms of trying to resolve the conflict is that it's become a distraction. Well, I would call it a distraction, others might disagree, but it's become the only thing anyone's talking about because everybody's just very animated about drugs. They're bad, don't you know? And so, the neighboring states after the earthquake at the beginning of last year, when they were really worried about the power vacuum around the region, decided to let Assad back into the Arab League, and rather than using anything to do with sustainable peace or actually what might be good for the people of Syria, be they those living inside of the country or those millions who've been forced to flee, the top of their list of things that they were going to engage with the regime about was reducing the Captagon trade, which has really nothing to do with the drivers of the conflict. It's a symptom of the conflict itself. And so they've been trying to engage with the regime on that issue, and they're using a metric of some sort of reduction in that as success in their great sort of political engagement with the regime, and never mind the human rights abuses or the refugees or the ITPs or any sort of trying to resolve the conflict. And that has also kind of spread to the West. So you've just had 2 bills going through the House in the US where they're sanctioning people involved in the Captagon trade, and they want to have an interagency working group looking at Captagon. And this is, states that we've desperately been trying to get to engage further on the peace process for years and years and years, have very, very little interest in doing so beyond lip service, and suddenly the only way you can get them engaged is to worry about this drug problem, which I would suggest is a little bit like running around putting a band-aid on a cancer patient, you know what I mean? Yes, let's try and reduce the drugs trade. It's not good for people across the region to be getting addicted to drugs. There are definitely consequences of this proliferation of Captagon, but unless you're actually going to use some of that political energy and leverage and engagement to resolve the conflict, to deal with the regime itself and where all of this is coming from, it's just going to be whether you might reduce Captagon, it's going to be some other problem that they start. There's going to be another illicit trade that they get into. You're seeing those sort of trades in gold coming out of Sudan, for example, and funding sort of different war machines. It's not always drugs, but it certainly is always illicit trade, and it will pop up somewhere else.
What are the echoes in Wa State and Myanmar of that? I mean, and particularly in relation to, I guess, external influences. You mentioned the fact that WA's essentially outwitted the DEA and the CIA, but there's also, you mentioned briefly the role of China, which I guess is the dominant power in the region, and maybe you could say a little bit more about how China is interacting there.
Yeah, I can actually tie it all together. So we were talking about conflict just now. In this particular situation in Wa State, narcotics don't necessarily bring conflict. As I mentioned before, Wa State is actually the most stable part of Myanmar right now because the civil war is happening all around it. Nobody wants to come and mess with the Wa. So let's look at we'll talk about like the U.S. strategy on its border and China's strategy on its border because Wa State is right on the other side of China. As I understand it, I'm not an expert on the U.S.-Mexico border, but what it looks like is happening to me is the U.S., the DEA, goes in and tries to tear down cartels, to take out its leaders, to weaken them. This creates power vacuums, and so you have smaller competitors trying to come in and fill that power vacuum when there is one, and the most vicious one often wins the day. Probably overgeneralizing, but that seems to be what's happening. This is part of the reason why you have this, hundreds of thousands of deaths in Mexico. That's not what's happening in East Asia. So China has a different strategy. It looks at the big bad narco state, big bad cartel, if you like, on its border and says, okay, we'd like to have a relationship with you. It actually, Wa State has some pretty impressive weapons, like anti-aircraft weapons, armed personnel carriers, armed drones. They're all coming from the People's Liberation Army of China. Go on Google and you can see them parading them around like it's a North Korean military parade. They're showing off their gear. It's all Chinese stuff. China also supports them with cell phone towers and medical aid and road building and things like that. Why do they do that? Why would China's Communist Party back a narco state? It's not because they're evil, it's because it actually makes a lot of sense. There is an understanding that if we prop you up and you control most of the border over which drugs would be pumped into China, we have leverage over you. Now China can say, actually, here's the deal. If you want to keep receiving weapons and aid from us, make your drugs, they got to go somewhere else. And they do. And this is why you have in places like Thailand, in mainland Southeast Asia, they're catching now more than 1 billion of those little meth pills I talked about, catching more than 1 billion of those a year. That's what they catch. So in the DEA, it's commonly said they probably catch 10%, maybe. So are there 8 or 9 billion of these meth pills swishing around? I don't know. Nobody knows. But this is a very effective policy that China has. I'm not suggesting the US should go make nice with the cartels and back them because it doesn't work. The cartels have no broader agenda other than let's get really effing rich, right? Wa State does. They want to maintain a state, and so you can kind of work with them more. But it's a very interesting, different dynamic.
That's a really interesting point, actually, because I was going to ask whether it makes a difference if the people controlling the trade are a cartel or the mafia, or whether they are a state, whether undeclared in Wa or declared in Syria. Does it make, you're suggesting it does make a difference. I just wonder what Emma and Max think about that.
Just say that again.
Sorry. That's all right. Whether it makes a difference, whether the people who are controlling the drugs trade are a state, whether recognised or otherwise, or whether they are essentially the mafia, a cartel, a crime syndicate.
Yeah, I mean, it's a really good question. I'm not quite sure about that one. Have you got any ideas?
I can only really speak to Syria, where there is the plausible deniability. It's not like the regime are running around going like, it's us, it's us. They're suggesting that it's all these frightfully naughty young people they keep patching and putting little pictures on their Facebook pages. So there is, even when it is a state, there's a plausible deniability. But I don't personally have a deep knowledge of a comparison to. That's your problem, Max. Back to you.
It's apples and oranges, so it's a difficult question.
Former global drugs editor of Vice should have an opinion here. No, that's fine. I mean, where do you think the drugs? I mean, I guess if you think of the three examples we've given, most people have heard of the drugs trade in Mexico and fentanyl going into the US. Some will have heard of Captagon in Syria. I suspect very few, actually, probably one of the reasons why you wrote the book, would have heard of WAR. Is it going to be something which is going to be on the front pages in 10 years' time, that area of the world?
So one thing I'm waiting for the day is I turn on cable TV news and, you know, some Republican lawmaker in the US is like, China is backing a narco state. Well, unfortunately, they could say that and it would be completely true, and it could be used to, you know, rile up the U.S. into this whole anti-China vibe. But you can go online and find pictures of the DEA indicted leader of WA State sitting next to a diplomat appointed by Xi Jinping. It's not a secret. It sounds like a conspiracy theory, but it's not. I wonder when people will become aware of that, and when they do, I hope that they have a rational response to it, and it's not used to just, you know, gin up something darker. I will say this, I'm not sure that the military regime in Myanmar will exist in 5 years. I promise you, I shouldn't say that, I really, really think that WA State will exist in another 30 years. It's existed for 35 years already. I think it's here to stay. If Google Maps reflected reality more, it would delineate where WA State is inside Myanmar so that everybody could see it. That's one of the most fascinating things about it. It's this essentially a nation state hiding in plain sight. And I'll just wrap this answer with this. You might wonder, like, why haven't I heard about this? It's because the leaders of WA State are not running off to the UN saying, please recognize us, please put our flag on your own. We want to be an independent, sovereign nation state. If you ask them, they will say, oh no, we're part of Myanmar. Nothing to see here. They've been denigrated for so long and treated as, you know, outlaws and villains for so long. They're not interested in the international community's narrative about them. They don't want any heat, so they'll be like, nope, nothing to see here, and this is why they don't, you know, wave their banner and try to get everybody's attention. They would rather exist in obscurity. I think it's a very smart strategy.
Okay, I have a couple of other questions, but questions from the floor. We've got a microphone somewhere.
It's okay.
We have another one. So I have one question over here, and then, okay, well, so we've got two in the middle. Where?
Yeah, sorry, I'm just looking at it.
Okay, let's do this one. We'll come to you, sir. Several at the back there.
Thank you. I was just wondering if the panel has any opinion on the role of legalization in the drug trade. So beyond just what we're seeing in the West with legalization of marijuana, do you think there is a role that could play in combating the international drug trade?
Could you pass? Yeah, no, right here, yeah. Well, I'll come over there in a minute.
To what extent do you think social media or any new technologies are playing a role in the growth of these narcotic states and new and different forms of drugs, especially synthetic drugs?
One more question down here.
Yeah, two quick ones, if I may. Max, how do you calculate that the cartel employs 175,000 people, number one? And number two, an observation, I was wondering what you think about the government in Mexico and the cartel is really, one cannot exist without the other, and they're just one group wearing two different hats. And Emma, quickly, what are the main markets for Captagon? Thanks.
Okay, so we've got legalization, social media, symbiotic relationship between cartels and government, and market of Captagon. So who wants to go first?
I might as well say something. Yeah, so look, legalization, you know, you're obviously taking away, say, let's take weed in in America, for example. So you are taking away the lion's share of the market from the gangsters. So it's bound to have an impact. In America, you know, the gangsters are still there selling weed because the system is still sort of still learning to walk. So in say, for example, California, you know, you still got a lot of illegal weed being sold. But it can only legalization. You know, the government management of a product can only result in less money for organised crime, and organised crime having to then shift to slightly other things. You know, whether that might be people trafficking, logging, fraud, whatever it might be. So for definite. Even though the effects have been quite slow in the US weed trade, definitely legalization is the enemy of organised crime. I mean, you would presume, a bit like maybe big tobacco have done with cigarettes, that organised crime, like they've got involved in vapes and all that stuff, they would sort of maybe shift it slightly and somehow keep involved in the legal industry as well. And what was the next, social media?
Social media.
So yeah, I mean, like in some countries, social media, particularly I'd say things like, I don't know if you can count, you know, in messaging apps, you know, WhatsApp and things like that, Telegram. Are you counting that as social media? I don't know, but look, for sure, social media is a big way of selling drugs. You know, like my Instagram feed is absolutely packed with people offering all sorts of drugs. It's how a lot of younger people are buying their drugs. It's very, you know, very efficient, very quick. You can see what they got. And in some countries, the whole sort of social media messaging apps absolutely dominates the drug trade. And it's one of the main methods that people buy drugs, more so than just phone calls or hand-to-hand kind of hand-to-hand dealing.
And then there was the question about Mexico and it was the numbers, wasn't it?
Well, I was just curious in terms of how does one calculate the number of people that a cartel employs, and number two, the observation I made with regards to, I just came back from Mexico, spent some time there, and it seems to me that the lines of delineation between who gets elected and who runs the cartels, it's just wearing different hats, but one depends on the other. And so, you know, you said good luck to Claudia, right, the new president, but I don't think she'd be elected without the endorsement, or to some degree having some sort of an understanding with the cartel. Hence, you had so many assassinations.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think that she's got the nod from the cartels. I don't think the cartels are that powerful in Mexico to have that say in who actually runs the country. I have not seen any evidence to show that. It's easy. I can understand people thinking that might be the case. I've not seen any evidence to say that is the case. And like I said earlier, like the description of the duopoly, I think in some parts of Mexico, you know, some parts of Mexico, it is run by the government, and it is also run equally by the cartels. In other parts of Mexico, it isn't like that. But I don't think they're sort of, you know, I think there is some sort of interrelationships there and people working with each other. But I think when you're getting up to prime minister level, I mean president level, I don't think it's that close. And in terms of the 175,000 employees, I think that was a result of some sort of report and study that someone obviously did into, you know, like into the you know, this huge sort of entanglement of the cartels in everyday life, and you know, from people working in, for example, in the holiday parts of Mexico and the beaches, there's a lot of pharmacies which sell pills and potions and stuff that have been made by the cartels, and they're sold as not like pills in the pharmacies. So it actually stretches, you know, not just from sicarios and assassins and smugglers. It stretches across so much of of the country. So that's why I presume it's so huge, because it's all encompassing, especially in some areas. Yeah.
Emma.
But the thing with Captagon is it's not a very sexy drug, right? It's like a mild stimulant, and so it hasn't really taken off outside of markets where there's nothing better to do. So it's sort of domestic in Syria and across the region. It hasn't really taken off in Europe. There is some increasing use. There's been busts in Italy, and there's some production in Germany and the Netherlands, and then increasingly in Africa, Somalia, Libya, and so forth, because it's used to sort of keep folks awake if they're fighting or doing, transfers of folks, refugees and so forth.
The focus is regional.
But it's predominantly Middle East focused. It hasn't really taken off, because it doesn't really compare to sort of recreational drugs that folks can get in Europe in the same way, although there is some small market in Europe.
Patrick, can I find Wild State on Facebook? Or the question about social media is fascinating. I mean, does it play any role?
Don't know if it's exactly the question you were asking, so I'll just make up something else and say it, since I have the microphone. No, but the BBC calls Wild State one of the most secretive places on earth. Fair enough. I mean, part of their territory is north of Thailand, so if anyone's ever gone backpacking in Thailand, if you start to go north of Chiang Mai or Chiang Rai, you'll end up in Wa territory. Well, I wouldn't advise you do that, because they will not welcome you with open arms. So it is indeed very secretive. It's very difficult to get there, nearly impossible for most people. However, on social media, these 30,000 troops I mentioned, that's men and women, they now have like Huawei Chinese smartphones. And as I mentioned, there's cell phone towers in Wa State provided by China. So they are on the Chinese equivalent of TikTok, which is called Douyin. And so I've been using Douyin to peer into the lives of, these supposed narco warriors. And it's like a bunch of 18-year-olds doing like TikTok dances and posting thirst traps and acting exactly like any other 18 to 25-year-old would in any other part of the world, trying to look cute and posting photos with like gauzy filters and everything. I actually think it's helped humanize them. I know most people aren't watching Chinese TikTok, okay, but it has offered a window into the lives of these people that are mostly denigrated as, vicious, savage narco warriors and all that stuff.
And would legalization make any difference to the composition of Wa State?
Ooh, yeah, it would be horrible for them. It would take the financial engine of the state and just like throw it down a chasm. But this is in an imaginary world where the drug markets of Asia, which are like, say, Thailand, Philippines, and so on, the governments are functional enough to run a legalization regime where there's state factories producing, narcotics that would substitute for meth and heroin. I mean, I just don't see it happening. What I would like to see is some grand experiment run where the countries of the world that do have these big drug markets, legalize it for a couple of years and see if the human suffering, it goes up or down. I think it might go down. I'm not sure. That's why I'd like to do it in some sort of parallel universe so we could see how that experiment runs and then run back if it ends up being a total disaster. But it can't be much worse than it is now. And if you look at the death toll in places like the US, it's horrible. It's really, really horrible. And so the drug war has passed the 50-year mark. It's just not working. It has not delivered its promises, so something different has to be tried.
Okay, we don't have any other microphones, so I'm going to do a Jeremy Kyle impression. Come over here, because there are 2 or 3 hands. Let's go here first.
He loves it.
Yeah, thank you all very, very much. There was a huge loss when Vice released so many. I would urge anybody who isn't aware of the one from the Central African Republic on a certain organisation, really follow that. My name's Ewan Grant. I'm the old Customs and Excise Intelligence Analyst for transnational crime in the ex-Soviet states. The term organised crime is 20 years out of date because of big states involved. So my question is, how high up the League of Ultimate Controllers are President Xi, President Putin, and the Ayatollah Khomeini?
Hello, my question specifically for Patrick. You suggest that China blocks the export of methamphetamines, but where do the chemicals come from? Are they coming in from China? So are you telling us that the chemicals come in from China, but the export of the meths is entirely to Thailand, perhaps Malaysia and Bangladesh? That's part one. And part two, could you put the Wa into another context? But there are, of course, many, many ethnic states in Myanmar with some degree of autonomy. Are you suggesting that the Wa have more or less the monopoly on methamphetamine production, or just that they're one of many, the supreme one of the many others?
One more. Yeah. Thank you all for your thoughtful insights. Max, you alluded to AMLO's hugs not bullets policy. Given Claudia Sheinbaum's election and her strong political ties to AMLO, do you forecast her security policy representing some sort of continuity or a pivot from that? And bonus points if you're willing to take a guess as to what it might look like.
Okay. I've forgotten almost all of those already, so somebody needs to start talking. Patrick, why don't you start, because there were some quite specific questions about Wa and other ethnic groups in Myanmar in particular.
Really good questions, by the way. And no, they do not have a monopoly on it. What they actually have is they have the territory. So I don't want to get into the weeds too much, but if anybody has ever heard of Kun Sa, he was a very famous drug lord in Myanmar. The Wa have conquered his territory. So they have much of the border with Thailand at this point. This is the corridor through which narcotics produced in Myanmar go into the outside world, Thailand being both a consumer of drugs and a country that has ports where they can be exported onto Australia and wherever. So the Wa control that. What they actually do have not quite a monopoly, but a really iron grip on is anyone moving through that territory they can tax. What they're actually doing is a more sophisticated model now. They will invite Chinese crime syndicates to come onto their territory, and they will show them to a patch of land, usually near a stream or river, because making meth requires a lot of water. And they will say, build your meth lab. You guys have more expertise on this anyway. You also have better sources of chemicals. So yes, the chemicals, namely pseudoephedrine, that's being used to make methamphetamine, is being siphoned off from China's pharmaceutical sector. And so, yes, that's coming in. The Chinese syndicate would make the meth, and the Wa would guard it or protect it, but it's their territory anyway, so the law isn't going to come knocking. And then they would charge a tax or a fee upon that meth lab, and then they would charge yet another toll when it exits Wa territory and goes into Thailand. No other group has this. So yes, there are plenty of other groups that are making methamphetamine. They don't have the territory that the Wa does. That's what makes them such a dominant player. As far as the control that Xi Jinping has over Wa State in particular, I can't speak too much to that because I haven't chatted with Xi in a while, but I think that what the Chinese state could do is probably force the Wa to, be able to produce less methamphetamine. Everything that moves through China, as I understand it, has a great deal of surveillance placed on it. I mean, I think that they could probably figure out exactly which criminal syndicates are going to Wa State and what they're doing. I think they want to get rid of them. So if I was China and I had a criminal gang in Guangzhou and I, put the screws on them and then they moved to Wa State, cool, great. Hang out here. You're going to hang out somewhere. Go hang out on the other side of the border. And so I think that it benefits China in many, many ways.
I'll come to Emma first if I can. You look like you're ready to go. But can I go do Emma first?
Yeah.
Oh, thank you. There was, I mean, the question about Xi, Putin, the Ayatollahs. Obviously, in the Syrian context, is it the Assad regime, or is it a lot of it go right to the man himself? And also within the Syrian context, what is obviously there's a close relationship between the Assad regime and Russia. Does that involve an aspect to do with drugs?
I wouldn't say that. I mean, I don't have clarity particularly, but I think Russia currently has less influence over Assad than they did, and the relationship with Iran is much stronger. So I guess if those actors wished to say to their rather petulant client state that he should stop doing this, that they would be able to, but again it comes down to who's going to make up the money. I'm not sure that they're necessarily involved or thoroughly endorsing it, but nor are they trying to stop it.
Mexico.
Yeah, I just wanted to sort of like on the whole China thing. I just thought that I just had a thought, and it's just incredible that China has sort of almost by accident become like the hidden mixer in the global drug trade, just because it's got more chemical factories than anywhere else. It's absolutely just like tens of thousands of them, and it's just it's like it's supplying all the raw materials for this absolute huge production machine in the Golden Triangle, in Myanmar, which is one of the big, it's pumping out billions of these pills, and it's also supplying all the raw materials for the Mexican cartels, who are in turn supplying North America with all its opioids now, and supplying a lot of raw materials for the massive growth in methamphetamine in America, and also increasingly in Europe and Iran and Africa as well. So I just thought that it was interesting that China sort of by almost proxy, by sort of accident, had just become this huge figure in the global drug trade. I just wanted to get that out.
Okay, and any thoughts on the Mexican security policy in particular?
Yeah, so like I think so far Scheinbaum has said that she wants to, like AMLO, avoid head-on confrontation with the cartels. I would also be quite scared too. And apparently she's planning to cut crime by deploying some of the same policies she says worked in Mexico City when she was mayor there. So it's like beefing up detective capabilities and social programs to keep young people off the streets. But it definitely is the case that the polls show that the public, their number one want is to reduce the violence. So a lot of people are just thinking because she's a bit AMLO style, people are not very confident that she will reduce that. And also just to add, as I was saying about China and the rise of synthetic drugs like methamphetamine and fentanyl around the world, it's very, very much more difficult tackling synthetic drug production than it is tackling the growth of coca leaves and poppies and cannabis, because the synthetic drug production is so much more nimble, it's so much quicker, it involves all these sort of grey market chemicals. So the job that she has in trying to reduce Mexico's production of meth and fentanyl, which obviously impacts the US more than anyone else, is a colossal one and extremely difficult.
Okay, I'm going to take one more round of questions. I'm going to go to the back first. This is keeping me fit at least.
Thank you so much. I'm Hadani Ditmars. I'm the author of a book on Iraq called Dancing in the No-Fly Zone. And I'm actually from Vancouver, where they legalized hard drugs and then it didn't work, and they made them illegal again recently, and we're still having a huge drug crisis. And apologies for arriving late. I was at a Chatham House Iraq conference, and my question's actually about Iraq, and it's a general one to the panel, but perhaps specifically to Emma, because you're a fellow at the Middle East Institute, or I also write. So when I was interviewing displaced people, especially Christians in and around Mosul in the Nidda Plain, 10 years ago today, by the way, what was the, ISIS invasion, they talked a lot about the danger of the Hashashabi militias, which are Iranian-backed or not, but Shia militias, it's arguable. So I don't know if there's a direct connection to Iran. Being dangerous, but also being very involved in the crystal meth trade, and I would love to hear all of your opinions about that.
Was there a question over there somewhere? Any other questions? Yeah, there was one right in the corner, I thought so. Had to be the other side of the room. Here we go. Hi. There we go.
Yeah, I have. I just wanted to know, since a lot of people, like the local population, depends on the drug trade. Has there ever been a successful model of putting something else in instead of the drug trade in any of the countries, so that the local population would still be surviving on something else?
One more question, anyone? Yeah, I've got one here from Ravi.
Hi, thanks. Patrick, actually 2 questions. One, how did you report this story? Did you go to WA and do that? And 2, for anyone, just be curious to know how the crypto world, what role does that play in enabling the drug industry? Because it's obviously getting much more normalized, particularly in the States. I'm just curious to know if that plays a big role or no role at all.
Great. Emma, do you want to go first with Iraq?
I am not an expert on the Iraqi meth trade, but I would say that Hezbollah and other sort of Iranian-backed proxy militias across the region are involved in the Captagon trade, and of course there are those porous borders across between Syria and Iraq, again because of the instability, and that is sort of where the kind of trade happens. So I don't want to wade into answering incorrectly, but just to say that elsewhere in the region those kinds of militias are very much involved in parts of the Captagon trade.
Can I just add something into that? Yeah, I think it was last year we sent out a reporter, Mohammed Razul, to Basra to report on exactly this. So yeah, it's the meth trade being run by Iran-backed militias, and there's a lot of sort of gunfights between them and the cops, and so have a read of that, unless you may have already done so.
Patrick, how did you report the WA story? And I mean, each of you, it's particularly the question, well, there's the crypto question and the question about what has ever been done anywhere to try and replace drugs with a different sustainable form of income.
I'll take the second one first. Yeah, they've tried, the UN has tried coffee, and there's been attempts to do rubber. So people that planted the opium poppy, they would go in and try to plant rubber instead. Rubber is something that is highly portable and has value. You can make, I don't know, car tires out of it or whatever. It doesn't work, basically. Drugs are much more profitable. How did I do? Oh, okay. All right, so I've been beating my head against the wall trying to get access to the United Wa State Army for 10 years. 11 or 12. Remember that I've been in Bangkok for 16, so for much of my time there. 5 years ago, I had a lucky break. I became acquainted with a former top 3 leader of the WA organization. To my surprise, we became quite close and got to know each other more and more. He was very revealing with the things that he told me. And ultimately he said, listen, while I was top 3 within WA State in the highest echelons, I was also a DEA asset. Okay, well, I think I've got a book on my hands now. And so, of course, you have to check these things out. And so I said, okay, you got to give me a name of one of your DEA handlers. And he told me a name, and I checked, and that guy was dead. Damn it. So I found that guy's partner, and I reached out to him, and I said, I met this guy, and I described him, and he's like, oh yeah, Superstar. I said, excuse me? He's like, that's what we called him. That was his code name, Superstar, because he gave them such incredible information about WA State. And the reason that he talked to me and the reason he was talking to the DEA is because he had this dream. And his dream was that his WA people, after being denigrated for centuries, would come into the light and befriend the United States of America and become friends of America. And they would shut down their drug trade, and instead the Americans would bring in aid, would modernize them, bring them schools and hospitals and roads and actually all the stuff the Chinese Communist Party later did, but anyway. But America would do that, and this proposal was taken very seriously at the top of the WA organization, and to my absolute shock, it was taken very seriously at the top of the DEA. I had the head of global operations of the DEA said, yeah, we were working on this really hard, and the CIA sabotaged it. And if you want to know how,
But what do you think?
you can buy Narcotopia.
How would that, like, this, if that was a sliding doors moment and that had gone ahead versus the Chinese taking it, like, how would you see that?
If it had worked out, I think there would have been, I know there would have been a very serious clash within WA State for, I guess, the soul of the state between the drug traffickers. The drug trafficker in chief of WA State then and now is this guy named Wei, who I always say dresses like a Radio Shack assistant manager. I don't know if that works in the UK. That anyway, you know.
Kinda.
Okay, all right. He's got OCD. He's incredibly intelligent. He will not allow his photo to be taken. He exists only in the shadows. He does not want to be Pablo Escobar, but he's also very ruthless. And so his faction of things would have, and they already began to fight this idea of the American aid coming in and making everything tra-la-la. I don't know if it would have worked or not. What I do think is really interesting is that it was an alternative to the war on drugs as we know it. The DEA was actually going to one of the more powerful cartels, if you like, in Asia, and saying, okay, we'll cut you a deal. You wind down the drugs and we'll all be friends and we'll give you money instead. You can find DEA folks and drug policy experts who will say that that would have worked, and some will say that it wouldn't have worked, but it would have been nice to have the experiment play out.
Has any Max or anyone else got any thoughts on crypto, and I guess as a way to sort of launder drug profit and so forth?
Yeah.
Is the relationship there?
Yeah, just a very quick thing, and it'd be great if I could just make before we finish, make a final sort of point. It's just something I want to say again, get off my chest.
Well, I was about to say I want to ask you one final question. You can say what you like to that, but
Yeah.
crypto first.
Yeah, crypto. So yeah, where I've come across that is in Russia. So I have been working for a few months on this big report I'm doing, which hasn't been published yet, on Russia's drug market. And in that country, the darknet web is absolutely colossal. It makes the dark web in the West look absolutely minute. And money laundering is a big, and crypto money laundering is a big earner for these darknet marketplaces. So I just wanted to just quickly mention that.
So my final question, and you can answer in any way you like, obviously, was, I guess the point I want to make is that the international drug trade is not like plumbing, right? It's not like a problem you can fix. It's a social condition on a vast scale to which you have to continue to adjust. And so I guess my question is, in closing thoughts, anything else all three of you want to say is, are there things that, and it's a big question, that Western policymakers could and should be doing in a different way? That's a whole other debate in some ways, but that's the question in my head. But each of you, please come up with some closing thoughts. Max, do you want to go first? Since you've clearly got something about things to say.
Thank you. Right, yeah, I just, the thing I wanted to get off my chest was that obviously we've been talking about quite extreme examples, you know, in you know, the Syria's Captagon and the Wa state and Mexico. But just a sort of a reminder and just a sort of a thought, it was that, you know, that the global drug trade and organised crime is a big expanding beast. You know, it certainly isn't reducing in any shape or form. It's absolutely expanding all over the world in unexpected places. You know, impacting places, you know, remote places like Fiji. You know, and I've already mentioned China being sort of accidentally involved in it. And I think one of the interesting things is, like, it's not just sort of corrupt or, you know, famously corrupt or war-torn areas where the drug trade is starting to gain power. It's in Europe, and that's because Europe is obviously a lot more secure, has a lot more kind of high levels of security than, say, Mexico, for example, or Myanmar. But they also have extremely lucrative drug markets because everyone's got tons of money to buy drugs. So a lot of the organised crime groups have really turned their sort of eyes to Europe recently, and you can see in countries like Holland and Belgium and Germany the kind of the creeping influence of groups like the 'Ndrangheta, the biggest Italian mafia, and also the Mokro mafia, sort of a Dutch Moroccan mafia. These sort of groups are starting to have quite a large sort of impact on communities in this area. You know, even in Sweden, there's a massive problem with bombings and killings in that country that's linked to the European-wide drug networks, and a new sort of breed of gangsters that are growing across Europe. You know, it's affecting, you know, the mayor of Marbella, her husband and son-in-law are massive Swedish gangsters. Well, the husband just died actually, but so I just wanted to just say that it's not just the kind of the extreme examples, is that the drug trade and gangsterism and organised crime is seeping into literally everywhere.
Yeah, that's a very good point. Emma?
Two things. One would be that sort of this trend of just allowing conflicts to drift and deciding it's all frightfully difficult and we should probably just stay home is untenable and will only help to perpetuate this. And the second is that I think, you know, it's easy to think it's all crypto and like top secret international gangs, this, that and the other. Actually, a lot of the people involved in the drugs trade in Syria and in illicit trade in other conflicts are related to each other. They have bank accounts in states that are sometimes allies of Western countries. You know, we give them aid contracts with the millions of, you know, there's just so many points where there is contact and the potential for greater due diligence to try to ensure that individuals who are engaged in these kind of activities, particularly in extractive ways that are harming the places that are, you know, it's not just about, oh, we don't like them and they're making money for drugs. No, they're actually damaging the place that, and the community that they are supposed to govern and expecting us to foot the bill for it eventually anyway. That, you know, going after bank accounts, particularly in the UAE, I think is something that is just seen as a non-starter by policymakers, and any kind of chilling effect there would be helpful. I think with sanctioning as sort of the only aggressive foreign policy tool that's being used in so many of these environments, because there's a lack of desire to either use hard power or really meaningful diplomatic engagement to resolve issues, you're increasing the number of places where you are driving the whole sort of economic activity into this more sort of illicit space, and that's only going to help to fuel and perpetuate the networks between those places. I don't mean sort of the criminal gangs necessarily, but, you know, even state or semi-state actors, and that sort of is combined with the general instability of not resolving those conflicts and therefore getting off that path. You are creating a broader group of places and people that are finding ways to engage in this kind of activity.
we begin and end with War State.
What's the question? Oh.
Yeah. Closing remarks, anything you
Closing, yeah. The floor is yours, but...
I thought the question was, what should we do about drugs?
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Kind of, big one.
Well, as I mentioned before, the drug war is past the half-century mark with pretty poor results. The United States is the leader, the big crusader in this war on drugs, and it is a crusade, and is to a great degree a moral crusade. Once you get under the surface, it gets incredibly muddled. You have the Central Intelligence Agency, the CIA, having a relationship with the Northern Alliance in Afghanistan, which they were narcotics traffickers, as I understand it. In Southeast Asia, during the Cold War, the U.S. spies relied on drug traffickers to creep across borders and gather intelligence. At the same time, some of those drug traffickers were moving heroin to South Vietnam, where it was going into the veins of US GIs. It's incredibly complicated. It's not as black and white as certainly the US would like it to seem. And often, the great crusader, the United States, is very bad at predicting the outcome of its interventions, not just in the drug trade, but certainly in the drug trade. So my radical proposal, policy proposal to the United States would be, oftentimes, you can do nothing. Crazy idea, I know. We seem to think that we have to have a say in everything. Sometimes we don't have enough background knowledge or understanding of a situation, or just confidence that this intervention will make things better. So I think oftentimes, and I'm really specifically referring to the Asian context here, the US could have done nothing, and I think the outcome might have been better.
Okay, well, if you want to know more about War State, there is a table over there packed with books. Some of them might even get signed, I don't know, but you can buy a copy of Narcotopia over there. But for now, I just want to say thank you to Max and to Emmet and to Patrick, and thank you all very much for coming.